Merci. Bonjour. Enchanté. That's about all the French. um, Thank you. I'm really excited to be a part of this project. Sita and I have been trying to find a project that we can work together with, and this is certainly something right up my alley. For today, I would actually like to talk about some of the issues that need to be examined when we look at transplantations, especially for corals. There's a little bit of sex. I'm not sure, Mika, how much sex he's expecting, but we'll see. So one of the things, can everybody see me? I'm like a little nubbin, a little coral nubbin. So everybody can see me okay, yeah? All right. So when we're looking at transplantations, a long part of this is really looking for trying to understand why you have to transplant in the first place. This is whether it's for corals, seagrasses, or mangroves. We need to understand why things failed naturally before we could truly intervene artificially. Because if the issues are still there, the success rate of our intervention is going to be quite poor. And this has been the biggest trial that we have faced, particularly in the Caribbean, because while our hearts are in the right place and we're very quick to get nubbins in the case of corals and seedlings as it relates to mangroves, etc., we transplant things in more of a haphazard manner. That's how it started. So today I would like to spend a little bit of time going through some of the considerations that we will need to take into consideration. One of the first things, of course, is why corals have disappeared. One of the biggest issues we have faced in the Caribbean is diseases. Diseases is something that is very new to the geological record when it comes to corals. Prior to the 1970s, most of the geological records, when you do cores, they've had very stable communities, stable amounts of variations of coral skeletons. In the Caribbean, it means the acroporid species, commonly called the elkhorn corals, which is Acropora palmata, and the staghorn corals, Acropora cervicornis. Up until this point, up until the 70s, there's been very little variation. After that, it's all hell has broken loose. It has been major shifts in the sorts of corals that we have identified in our geological record. And a large part of this is attributed to diseases. Up until the 70s, the majority of things that were seen were primarily bleaching and tumors, things like skeletal anomalies. Between the 70s and very much so the 80s and 90s, we as the Caribbean, became a hotspot of disease. At the same time, we recognized we were a hotspot for biodiversity. But diseases were making a bigger mark in the coral world than the diversity of corals. And this is because during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, something has changed, something we are still not sure of. Something has changed that has caused diseases to take root, where we have lost, in some cases, 80, 90, 100% of particular species of corals. In the 80s, 82, 83, Acropora, both palmata as well as cervicornis, in many cases had 100% die-off, certainly in Trinidad, from where I am at. In addition, you had other species like diadema, which is a long-spined sea urchin, that was also dying off. And you had a lot of diseases, and so a lot of effort was being placed into trying to understand what was going on. You had black band, white band, coral people like colors, white band, black band, red band, yellow band, white pox, white type plague 1, type 2 sorts of things. And it was so drastic that we recognized that whatever was going on, not just that the diseases were increasing, but that the immunity of corals was decreasing. The immunity of corals meaning to say that in the 70s and the 80s, where you had only certain species being impacted, by the latter part of the 80s and throughout the 90s, you had the same coral being impacted by several different types of diseases, which meant that things were just getting worse. The prevalence and the virulence of diseases were getting worse, and the immunity and the impact on the corals were being quite tragic. In addition to this, we also note that there's climate change. In the earlies, bleaching, the hurricane season, these were things that we were very much used to. But the severity of storms have been increasing astronomically. There's been a 40% rise in the numbers of storms that we have every year. And the intensity of the storms are also increasing. Now, Mika talked about temperature. Now, temperature is certainly a big thing, yes, of course. But in the world of corals, that's just one aspect to look at. Increasing temperatures allow for not just stress of corals, but it also encourages the solution or the transference of atmospheric carbon dioxide into soluble carbon dioxide. And what this means is now we have to not just increasing temperatures to worry about, but we also have acidification to worry about. And acidification is something that you have to think about when it comes to the calcium carbonate, the very basis, the structure, the skeleton of corals. And if that declines, then the stress of the coral is going to increase as well. With storms, we would also have increased runoff. And with increased runoff, you have nutrients. Corals themselves and coral reefs like nutrient-poor waters, something that we call oligotrophic. They like nutrient-poor waters. They like lots of light. And of course, with storms, we have increased sedimentation, which decreases light. They like certain types of salinity. A lot of coral growth, in the Caribbean at the very least, they like salinity maybe around 25, 26, all the way up to like 32, 33 parts per thousand, ppts. With storms, of course, you have increased runoff. That means that the salinity is going to be declining. So not only are we having increasing temperatures, increasing acidification, we now have decreasing salinity and increasing sedimentation as well. All things corals don't like. We also have predation that's going to be occurring more and more often. As we learn more and as we spend more time, we're recognizing that other organisms find corals quite tasty. So you have worms, you have fireworms, you have a variety of snails or mollusks, and ciliates, which are teeny tiny organisms that to the naked eye you have to have a really good eyesight to actually see them. They almost appear like little black dots on the interface of what we first thought was a disease, but was really predation on some of these corals. You would have tourism pressures in Tobago. We would have glass bottom boat tours. I'm not sure if that's something that's here. But you would also have spearfishing, so you would have impacts to the rest of the ecosystem. You would have shipping, which was like a big deal, because with shipping, you also have potential for invasive species coming across as well. So there's been a lot of effort looking at diseases, looking at the preservation of corals, looking at the identification of the genotypes of corals, and more importantly, trying to find and create a biobank of these species in the event that we lose even more. All in all of these factors ultimately create stress. Just like you, when you become stressed, you get sick most of the time. Corals are no different. When they become stressed, the energy that they put forward to grow, to reproduce, etc., gets diverted in just survivalship. With increased acidification, they're just desperately trying to hold on to their calcium carbonate. By having increasing stress levels, they are having less energy to dedicate towards immunity. And therefore, in time, you're going to have more and more degradation of the reefs themselves. So, not very good. So transplantation efforts, particularly when it comes to coral reefs, ultimately, they're striving to improve reef resilience. Reef resilience is just a fancy term for just really trying to improve the ability for the corals themselves and the organisms, the wider ecosystem, to resist changes that the environment and other pressures are putting on them. And if they can't resist it, that they can recover from it, to at least come back to something that is relatively healthy. In order to examine resilience, In order to examine resilience, there are 4 things that we need to really look at. The first is the condition themselves. This is the corals and the wider ecosystem condition. We need to look at how well the larval supply is, the sources and the sinks of these organisms. We need to ensure that the environment that these larval forms are settling on, that it's a hard surface that they're able to actually establish. If there's too much, for example, fleshy algae, it's unable to compete, the corals, because they grow so slowly, they're unable to compete for space. We need to look at how well these recruits survive into juveniles and how well those juveniles survive towards adulthood. We need to look at the genetic diversity, because as you know, the more genetic diversity that you have, the greater the capacity for a particular species to recover. Every oops in your genetic code is potentially something that will cause that species to survive an environmental change. Once we have these genetic oopses and the genetic diversity on a system, we're better able to resist that disease, we're better able to resist the environmental changes, and we're increasing the likelihood of survivalship. We have to look at connectivity. I mentioned sources and sinks. Not necessarily all corals of the same species are necessarily going to survive in every location that you transplant them. If we are truly going to transplant and have the best chance of success, we need to look at where naturally our corals are being sourced from. So if we can identify that genetic flow, then we are again adding to the potential for success for transplantation. And of course the local environment, which perhaps is by far the hardest thing that we can control, but it is perhaps one of the most important ones that we need to consider. Of course, looking at the heat, the levels, how well wherever we're transplanting to, whether it's from a nursery area and or from the transplant sites, that it has very good flushing. Good flushing will also bring cooler waters, hopefully. Have good light levels, because of course corals like lots of light. Low sedimentation rates, etc. Right? So we need to look at all of these conditions and as a whole try to think about what makes a resilient reef. So there are a whole host of factors that need to be considered as a resilient reef system. And of these, you have a suite of which that are specifically related to coral transplantation. Some of the easiest ones, of course, is looking at the genetic diversity, the cover, the mix that we're having, the ability for it to recover in itself or to bounce back, and of course having adequate substrate for new corals to settle, not just the substrate that you are transplanting on top of, but also surfaces for new sources, new larval drift to settle upon. So the little bit of sex comes in now, where we're looking at, well, what are the mechanisms for transplantation? We really have asexual transplantation mechanisms, sexual, as well as the substrate and variation of substrate. Asexual reproduction is really just simply, quite put, you break off a piece of coral and you transplant it into a new area. Whether that new area is a nursery, where you give it a chance to recover, because of course breaking a piece of coral is very traumatic. You're causing a major injury at that site. So some scientists will put you in the recovery zone, in the nursery area, so that scar can heal, which happens, especially if the conditions are great, and then transplant it in the final area later on. You also have things like microfragmentation, which is basically taking the same nubbin and cutting into teeny tiny pieces, where you have at least the polyp, which is the actual animal in itself, as a whole, and that will allow it to survive. Something that small is something that we can transplant and make it survive. In terms of sexual transplantation, this is really where we recover the eggs and sperm of spawning corals, and then mix those, get the larval forms, let them settle in an artificial setting, and then transplant those. So it goes into a nursery and then goes back into the environment. And then, of course, we would have the substratum in itself, where we actually add surfaces to that environment to allow new settlement to occur. So if you just bear with me for 2 seconds, when we're thinking about the direct transplantation, this is by far the most common mechanism that's used throughout the Caribbean. It's the cheapest, let's face it. It's the least intensive. Of course, the guys and gals who go out every day and harvest and maintain the transplant sites and the nursery sites might tell you different, but this is by far the easiest mechanism. You don't necessarily need that nursery area, but they tend to choose corals that are the fastest growing, which are, for our systems, the acroporids. We go into the nursery area and the microfragmentation, as we mentioned before, and once they are healed, once they are large enough to withstand and are well in the way of growth in terms of dedication of their energy, so you would have energy dedicated to survivalship, you have energy dedicated to growth, you have energy dedicated to repair, you have energy dedicated to reproduction. And what you want is to make sure that you are in the phase where corals are just growing, and they're healthy enough to grow, and then transplant them elsewhere. Again, you're trying to give those corals the best opportunity for survivalship. Generally, this has about a 60 to 65% success rate in survivalship once you transplant them. They tend to have very good survivalship once you break the nubbins. But once you translocate them somewhere else, sometimes the water conditions are too different, the salinity is too different, the lighting is too different, too much algal growth, too much predators, not enough fish are going to be present to help to keep the environment clean enough and clear enough for corals to survive. A large part of survivalship for transplantation using this method is ultimately based on the environmental conditions, because everything else we can control and everything else tends to have very good survivalship. For sexual transplantations, and we're looking at the settlement of larval forms in this case, when looking at survivalship of the larval forms, this has only a 10% survivalship. That's normal, okay? And then everything else is the same as the artificial and the asexual transplantation. It has about a similar success rate. The difference is that asexual reproduction and asexual transplantation, you transplant clones, which means that there's very little genetic variation. With sexual transplantation with the larval forms and getting smaller nubbins from this particular method, you actually have a much higher genetic diversity, and therefore you are increasing the potential resilience of your transplant site. It is a little labor intensive, and you do have to follow the spawning calendar. But luckily for us in the Caribbean, the spawning calendar, you could get down almost to the hour of when corals are going to spawn by species. Okay? And of course, then the last type of transplantation is the substratum transplantation. Now, quite simply, this is just providing a hard surface structure in order for things to settle on. But more importantly, it also allows for other organisms to settle in this particular area. And by settling and having other organisms, having fish, having snails, having worms, these are all good things that they're able to help control the growth of algae around your site. Having these structures are important for the ecosystem balance. So it's not just a coral speciation interest that we have here, but ensuring that the ecosystem function, having different variety of herbivores on your site, for example, is a positive and important part of survivalship. So a transplantation site naturally should also have very good other biodiversity, preferably, or at least encourage that increase of biodiversity, in an increase of reef fish, for example. These particular structures need to be very well anchored because, of course, they can be taken up by storms. As we know, storms are increasing and the veracity of these storms are increasing as well. There's a newer technique where we apply electric field to some of these structures. So you would have metal bars that are connected to an anode and a cathode, and you have a battery system, typically from solar powered, and this is going to encourage deposition of calcium carbonate on the structures, which of course then aids other corals to settle on the system, but it also provides that little extra oomph of energy that it can be diverted to something else. So if I'm a coral and I'm getting help in precipitating my very important calcium carbonate structure, then I can spend that energy on immunity. I could spend that energy on growth and repair, etc. So this is something that is not seen very much in the Caribbean, but it is something that is taking off in the Caribbean as a mechanism for transplantation. Okay. So all in all, this particular mechanism and method, you would have much higher survivalship. You will have much higher settlement and growth and natural variation that's coming. And generally, it also has the added benefit of providing a physical barrier for the wave energy. So it does the same thing as a reef structure in terms of absorbing energy to protect our coastlines and our beaches. And of course, adding new habitat for the corals and other reef structures. So lastly, I would like to just talk about Guadeloupe from a perspective of the environment, corals, and just other agents. When we think about the environment for Guadeloupe and the transplantation sites and the nursery areas that have been chosen, things that need to be taken into consideration and have been taken into consideration by trial and error for some of it, is looking at the substrate type, the proximity of the substrate structures, the artificial structures that are being put down, the depth of which the nursery areas and the transplantation sites are held, because of course this is directly related to light. You'd want to have a site that has minimal sedimentation and nutrients, which is a little bit difficult based on the sites that have been chosen, etc. You would have the corals themselves. You'd want to look at the genetic variation, which is something that they have started to do. There isn't a huge variation in terms of the genotypes that have been discovered. For Cropra, it was like 6 for Cervicornis, I think, and 9, 11 for Acropora palmata. They appear to have very good growth rates, which is great in the nursery area. Very little disease, a little bit of bleaching when it comes to the hurricane season. But they did have one particular disease that I had observed on site last year, which is something called coral wasting disease, which is basically where you can the coral looks apparently healthy, you could touch it, and then the whole thing just dissolves in front of your face in seconds. We don't know what the cause of it, but we suspect it has to do with some sort of a bacterium. But in essence, we are trying to control as best as we can the environmental conditions to ensure that the coral health themselves is the most improved. Then we have the agents, and in this case we have those that are primarily predators and potential vectors of disease. At the nursery areas, these have been, for the most part, quite healthy. However, at the transplant sites is where we've had the majority of the problems, where the fireworms, the bearded fireworms, and certain mollusks have been the main culprits. We've adjusted our protocols a little bit, chosen variation of sites, and looking much more closely at the infrastructure that's available before we transplant, and it seems so far to be working, and we'll continue to monitor it for its success. And then, of course, overall, we're looking at trying to have as healthy an environment as possible to allow the corals to grow best, which means in our case, because our waters here are, I say ours, I'm partly Guadeloupe now, minus the ability to speak French, it takes a lot of effort to continue to clean the structures, both at the nursery site as well as on the transplant sites, because we do have nutrient-rich waters, which means that we're forever battling the algal growth. So that's quite labor-intensive. By choosing fast-growing corals, of course, we're giving the best chance for growth on our sites. And by having low disease prevalence, it means something must be going right. You know, we're at least giving, by allowing the corals a chance to, quote unquote, rest and recover from the nursery areas and to continuously harvest from those particular sites, we are enabling our environment to have a much higher success rate in terms of their survivalship. The problem is really the environment. And the conditions of the environment, which is very difficult to control. So monitoring our water quality is really key for this. And also, of course, trying to overcome a low genetic variability of the corals. Because as I said, the genotypes are relatively small, and therefore, potentially, we could look into cross-country transplantations as a potential for survivalship. And Mika's going to tell me I'm almost out of time, so I would leave it there and say merci, and I'll open for questions in time.